You're listening to the Otis Jiry channel. How Coyote Lost His Tail in a Poker Game by Vlek. Performed by Otis Jiry. Crow spotted Buffalo digging taters in the ground, so he swooped down and to poke around for any news he might be able to turn to good use. "Hey there, Buffalo. What you up to down there?" squawked Crow as he landed on his friend's backside and started looking things over in a way anybody but a half-wit would say was downright nosy. "Oh, just my usual, Crow," Buffalo replied, keeping a keen eye on Crow so's he didn't make off with any of his taters. "So I see. Commendable, Buffalo, truly commendable. It does a crow's heart good to see folks working so hard, looking after the future, thinking on what's coming down the road during the long, cold months ahead," muttered Crow absent-mindedly, glancing back and forth for any stray something-a-majig he could make off with in a hurry. Right about then, old Crow himself came trotting down the dirt road. It was such a fine day that he hadn't a mind to anything but enjoying the hot sun, baking his fur, so he was paying no mind to anybody's business but his own. "Say, Buffalo," Crow said, glancing over at Coyote and seeing him getting big as life as he came into view. "Yes, Crow," murmured Buffalo, not even looking up from his digging. He was used to Crow nosing around, and he knew when to let the curious tidbits of news slip, and he knew when best to keep quiet, too. "Well, I haven't seen that Coyote fella around in quite some time. You hear anything about that boy, or know where he got off to?" asked Crow, just loud enough for Coyote to hear him. Now, you can say a lot of things about Coyote, some good, some to be none too proud of, and a lot that's just downright strange. But two things don't ever change. One is Coyote's nosiness. Some folks say more nosy even than Crow. And the other is Coyote's obsession with his favorite topic of all things in the world, Coyote. So when Coyote heard this noise about himself, he stopped right dead in his tracks. There was a big old oak tree nearby, and he ducked behind it and hid so he could spy on Crow and Buffalo and hear what they were saying about him. "Well now, Crow, it's mighty strange that you should mention Coyote of all folks just now. As a matter of all fact, I was hearing tell just yesterday, from that old possum up by Meadow Road, that Coyote got himself into a whole mess of trouble up in the hills at the trappers' camp," said Buffalo, his tail swiping at a fly as he finally looked up at Crow and got a funny feeling he was up to something. "Well, did you now? And you believe that old possum, do you?" inquired Crow, his curiosity growing by the minute. "I do, Crow, I do. What he says this time just might have the ring of truth all around it," said Buffalo with a shake of his head, and as he took in the full picture of the whole unfolding scenario, Crow glancing off toward the road, Coyote barely hitting himself behind that tree in the middle of the road. Buffalo shook his head and smiled, thinking Coyote had gone to an awful lot of trouble to hide himself, but left that scraggly yellow tail of his waving out plain as day in the breeze. "Well, you know what they say, Buffalo. You think Possum knows something for sure, or is he just making up stories again?" "Course I know what they say about Possum. I've known him since I was a kid. But he's always been square with me, and he's not a bad sort. Just a bit cantankerous, that's all. Buffalo explained, grinning and starting to get a feel for the fun of the moment. He and Crow went way back, too, had that same funny outlook on life, and he wasn't about to let Crow work up anything good without him getting a piece of it. Well, go on, Buffalo. What did that old possum have to say? What happened to Coyote? Crow prodded, letting his enthusiasm show and his keen curiosity starting to look like a bluster. And as you can imagine, Coyote was getting hot and pestered listening to all this, and he could barely keep himself quiet. He knew of no such trouble up at the trapper feller's camp, unless he was forgetting something, or they was just telling stories on him again. He was about to burst out from behind that tree and demand to know what Buffalo knew, where that crusty old possum heard it, and why they was spreading stories about him again. Unless, of course, he had forgot about this particular slice of his history. There was indeed an awful lot to that history, he thought with a chuckle, and he supposed it was possible he'd forgotten one or two details along the road. In which case, he'd better hear the rest of what Buffalo was saying. So he bit his tongue and settled down to listen, ready at the drop of a pine cone to leap out and put an end to this pantomime. So, apparently, Buffalo continued, getting into the meat of the story and enjoying himself quite a bit. Buffalo went up to the trapper's place after he got run off the old Garnett ranch for stealing chickens. Well, that much is every damn yard of the truth, thought Coyote, chuckling to himself in satisfaction. Go on, that part sure enough makes good sense, said Crow with a sneer. And when he got up there, Coyote spotted a big stew pot a-boiling away, and the trapper's nowhere in sight. And what do you suppose happened right then and there? Asked Buffalo slyly, making sure he was speaking loud enough for Coyote to hear. Well, if nothing else, I bet that old boy helped himself to the stew pot and licked every inch of it clean, remarked Crow snidely. Well, now, Crow, of course he got into that stew pot and left nothing but a grease stain, or there'd be no story, now would there? Said Buffalo, looking at Crow like he was dumber than wood and nowhere as useful. And Coyote himself was sitting behind that tree, scratching his head and looking at his belly, and not finding a ring of truth in any of this yarn. Surely he'd remember all this, and a big stew on top of it, wouldn't he? Now, as I was saying, said Buffalo, making the whole damn thing up a word at a time as he was going along. Coyote finished off the last of the stew all right, licked his lips and got a buzz up his bonnet because that's all there was. But instead of hightailing it off that mountain before those trapper boys came looking for their supper, you'll never guess what the Coyote did. He fell asleep right then and there by the cook fire, took to snoring something awful, and even rolled himself up in one of the trapper's blankets. Well, if you've ever heard Coyote snore, you know those trappers got wind of it right quick. And they ran back into camp hungry, and they ran in mad. Laughed Buffalo so hard he had to hold his sides together so he didn't burst open like a watermelon. With all of this talk, Coyote was getting pretty riled up, and he was about to come out from behind that tree and whop the both of them a good one, when he heard Buffalo say, "Now listen closely, Crow, because this is a downright strange tale that makes me wonder if it ain't maybe true, because it shows Coyote for both the fool he is and for the wise old varmint that the stories talk about." And Coyote thought, well now, maybe this darn yarn of Buffalo's does have a grain of truth to it after all. So he quieted down his backside and listened. So anyway, those trapper fellers came barreling out of the woods and saw the stew pot knocked over dry as a bone, and a snoring coyote rolled up in a blanket all at about the same time. So one of the fellers grabbed up a big chunk of firewood and was about to wail on Coyote's hide. So Coyote woke up and turned tail to make a run for it, but the men had him surrounded. Buffalo paused here in the story to look at Crow, who took a look-see over toward Coyote and saw he was listening real close to everything that was being said. Crow nodded slyly with a tickle of a grin playing at the corners of his beak, and Buffalo started in on some of the more colorful details. Well, Crow, you know it looked pretty dismal for Coyote at that point. The men were hopping mad and arguing amongst themselves about what to do. Some of them were scared of Coyote because of the old stories, but the younger men sneered and said he was nothing but an old varmint, and the tales was all bunk, made up to scare little kids and old women. Now, when he heard this part of the story, Coyote started to hiss and turned hot as a chili, and he started gnawing on his own paw to keep from jumping up and giving himself away. He just had to hear out the rest of this story, so he'd know how to get back at Crow and Buffalo and make that old possum pay for spreading lies that made him look worse than usual. Well, at about that time, Buffalo continued, trying to keep from busting up laughing. One of the men started grinning and looking at Coyote kind of funny. Then he started riffling through a deck of old cards he had on him, like one of them gals up at the casino. Before long, all the men was laughing and setting themselves down around Coyote and nodding his way, and Coyote started thinking he might be better off just getting a whooping and chased off the mountain than what he suspected these boys was up to. Well, Coyote got real nervous, and he started trying to bargain with the men. But the trappers said no. Damage was done, stew was gone, and there'd be no more that night. Then Coyote said he'd work off the stew, work real hard around the camp until it was all paid for. But those trappers were smart. They said, "No, Coyote, you see, we'd love to help you out and all, but we've got all the work done we need doing till spring." So Coyote, he swallowed real hard and get some courage from somewhere and says, "Well, just exactly what are you folks fixing to do here?" And the big trapper, the old boss man of the crew, he's chewing on something, and then he spits and says, "Well, now, after dinner, we was fixing to play some poker, relax a bit before turning in. Have some fun, that kind of thing. And since this is after dinner for some of us, well, maybe we'd best just go ahead with that card game after all. What do you say, Coyote? How does that sound to you?" And Coyote, by now, he's really sweating, but he muttered under his breath, "Sounds fine to me, seeing as I got no choice in the matter." "What's that?" said the boss feller. "Well, sounds fine, real fine," sighed Coyote, as he gave up all hope and started wondering what the hell his ante was going to be, since he was not quite flush in any manner of speaking at the moment. "Well, glad to hear it. I'll just set up these cards here, and we'll see who's who," said the trapper, nice and slow-like, while grinning an evil mouth full of crooked yellow teeth right up close in Coyote's face. At this point, Buffalo paused in the telling and looked at Crow. "Oh, what's that, Crow? You want to know what Coyote's ante was in that game? Well, you'll never guess in a coon's age, so I might as well tell you," Buffalo said with an air of undisguised mischief. Now, that big boss feller started tossing in bags of gold dust and one of the boys threw down a few old hides, and one poor kid just pitched in some old rustic knife. And then they all looked at Coyote to see what he was going to ante up with. "Well now, come on, Coyote boy, what's your ante?" sneered the boss man with a nasty grin. And Coyote, well, if nothing else, he's quick on the draw and twice as clever. He was thinking hard and fast, and needless to say, something came quickly to mind. "Well, sir, all I've got on me at the moment of any real value is this fine old tail of mine," blustered Coyote, as he fluffed up his scraggly tail a bit and showed it off to the men. But they all just started laughing and choking on their own wind. "That mangy old tail of yours," cried the boss man in shock and disbelief. "What would any of my boys want with that thing?" "Mangy and old it may be, sir, but Coyote's tail is far from worthless. Clearly you fellers never heard the strangest of tales that date back to the ancient times, the ones the old people still tell amongst themselves, and how Coyote's tail can make a man's wishes all come true, and his enemies have 9 years bad luck, then 90 more. But if you boys don't want the tail, I suppose I'll have to come up with something else," sighed Coyote as he started digging around for pockets in his yellow hide, and of course not finding anything. "Well, now, hold on a bit there, Coyote. I don't think we've heard that particular story, but that don't mean it's not mighty interesting just the same. So you just sit yourself down there. We'll deal you in. But you keep that tail of yours close by just in case you lose, that is," boomed the boss man, greedily eyeing Coyote's tail and already planning for his big windfall. "Fair's fair. Deal me in. If I win, I go on my way and thank you boys for some good eating grub. And if I lose, I walk away and leave you with Coyote's tail, and the best of luck to all of us. No hard feelings," declared Coyote, as he settled down and looked at the hand of cards the boss man dealt him. "No hard feelings," agreed the men as they all fell to eyeing their own cards and trying to glance around and steal a look at everyone else's. The boss man drew a card, and his men drew, and Coyote drew. Coyote saw worried faces of some of the men, but the boss man, he was calm and still as deadwood, a bent little smile playing around the ends of his whiskers that he didn't even try to hide. Then it was Coyote's turn to draw. Then one more time, and all the while the boss man stayed smug and silent as he leaned back on a stump of wood and chewed his tobacco. "Well, well, well, if that's not a full house that got me right here, then I don't know what one is," boomed the man as he threw down his cards. The other boys threw their own cards down and started grumbling as they got up and headed for the tents. This left just Coyote and the boss man sitting round the fire, eye to eye and nose to nose. "So, what you got, Coyote?" growled the man kind of low as he watched Coyote slump deeper and deeper into his hide as he glared at his cards. "Well, sir, fair's fair, and you got me beat. And you, sir, are now in possession of Coyote's tail," admitted Coyote with a strange air of unlikely resignation. "Well, then, let's get to it, boy," boomed the man as he jumped up and dragged a big bowie knife out of his belt and started to grab for Coyote's backside. Yes, indeed. Let's get to it," Coyote stammered. But you see, I believe I failed to mention that this here tail, this one right here, well, no, this isn't Coyote's true and original tail. This one's just a fake. Some miners skinned the real tail off me some while ago, and I've been itching real bad to get it back. But because you won it fair and square, I'd be more than happy, and twice as obliged to help you get it away from those miners, who I assure you are no friends of mine. explained Coyote as the man listened, his eyes growing dark and narrow with suspicion. "Those miners up by Gold Hill?" growled the boss man. "The very same," replied Coyote. "Boys, into your saddles, we're taking us a little ride," yelled the man as they all climbed onto their horses and tore out, heading up to the miners' camp. Because it just so happened there'd been a long-standing feud between the trappers and the miners up by Gold Hill, and this was just the chance the boss man was looking for. And Coyote was remembering the poor old ratty dog's tail he'd seen mounted up over the door to the miners' cookhouse with a sign saying, "Genuine coyote tail, just as nasty as you please." Coyote had never caught into those miners after that, and he hated that sign with a horrible, spiteful vengeance. So off they rode up to the miner's place, and when they got there, the boss man saw the sign, and he saw the tail hanging over the cookhouse door. So he went up and grabbed down what was rightfully his, and snatched up a couple of chickens and a side of bacon that he figured was rightly his, too, for good measure. And of course all the commotion brought the miners out of their tents, and when they saw the trappers, it was just an explosion of mayhem and melee as they all started fighting and scrapping and tearing up the place. In all the excitement of a good, clean fight, the trappers forgot all about Coyote, who hightailed it out into the desert and hid himself real good for a long while thereafter, until things quieted back down and the winter set in, and all the men had more on their hands to contend with than poker games and coyote tales. As Buffalo concluded his story, he looked over at the tree where Coyote was hiding and saw that bushy tail whipping around. "So what do you think, Crow? You think Possum was pulling my leg? Or do you think that story sounds just like the Coyote we know and the kind of crazy stunts he gets himself mixed up in?" asked Buffalo, grinning at Crow and waiting to see if Coyote would show himself now. Crow shook his head. "I'd say that story has a whole lot of ring of truth to it, Buffalo, a whole lot of truth. And maybe that old Coyote is smarter than I thought, just maybe." Crow had to admit, much as he hated to, that Coyote had some damn good stories being told around about him, and true or not, it was as good a Coyote story as the ones his grandpappy used to tell back in the early seasons of long ago. And Coyote, well, he didn't show himself to Buffalo and Crow at all that day. He just turned around and went on up the road the way he'd come. He didn't really remember having lived through any of the stuff in that particular story, but you can be damn sure he started telling it as his own everywhere he went, puffing up and bragging more and more with each telling. Adding details here and there, he made the yarn a good deal more preposterous and outside of the confines of all good sense and reason. But then that's Coyote for you. Not to be outdone, even by himself, in somebody else's story, Coyote set out to work up a whole mess of new material to try out on the unsuspecting folks over in the next valley.